Hello.
Hey!
It works.
I'm so shit with these things, so it's lovely to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Hello. I've gone red. I feel embarrassed. I don't know why. That's good
There's
stuff.
something so funny about doing these things.
Yeah.
This is my second, and I always just think it's not going to work. There's something will go wrong with technology.
I mean, it might. I can hear planes going overhead constantly, so that's good, but hopefully not too bad. Cool. Well, should we get started?
Yes, great.
So, Emma and I wrote about the Overwhelm a couple of months ago and asked Emma to contribute some thoughts on it, because one of the things that's a bit weird with Instagram, I think, is that it's great that people talk about loads of subjects, but sometimes it'll be people who aren't trained, qualified experts, especially around mental health stuff. So when I wrote about Overwhelm, I obviously can talk about my own experience, but I can't say, so this is what everyone should do. Whereas you can, because you've trained for 7 years or something more.
Well, how long? Yes, I've trained. Well, you do. Our doctorate is 3 years, but you tend to do quite a lot before that.
Yeah.
So quite a long process.
Yeah. So, and you had some really valid points. So I wanted to, whenever I talk about the Overwhelm, I get so many messages from people going, "Oh, I feel like this." And I think and then we've done a talk before where it was something that came up, and we talked about our generation and how it's quite tricky because we're trying to effectively be like our mums, in that we want to be there and present and cooking and managing most of the stuff at home, which I know it's not everyone, but most cases it is. But we also want to have a career, or we want to have a really good social life, and all these other things, which is just quite tricky, and I think contributes to the overwhelm. But just my own experience is I just start to combust. I kind of will be paddling along and thinking I'm okay, and then I'll put a few extra things in the diary, so that will be one thing, and then something like the dishwasher broke a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's
and then you're like,
you over the edge.
Yeah, and it's the admin, and it's like, it's just a broken dishwasher, like, you know, and also the guilt, because you think, well, some people don't have a dishwasher, some people don't have dishes to wash. Like, you kind of go into that, which I think we can definitely cover, because I had loads of messages about that, like just the feeling guilty that you feel overwhelmed, so then you don't do anything about it, you don't tell anyone, and then you still feel it. So
yes,
I think that's
absolutely.
So
it's a lot of big topics. Katie Kicks is just asking if I can introduce myself. Sorry.
Yes.
We forgot about that bit. So I'm Emma Svanberg. I'm a clinical psychologist. So I work in the perinatal period, which essentially means that I work with mostly women, sometimes partners too, around pregnancy, birth, and the early years. So I tend to do one-to-one therapy, but I also run a number of groups, and I write as much as I possibly can at the moment.
And you've got a book out?
I do. It's coming out on July the 11th, which is about birth trauma.
Yeah,
called Why Birth Trauma Matters. I should say that, shouldn't I?
Yeah, come on.
Yeah. It's called Why Birth Trauma Matters.
You're allowed to plug your own stuff.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay.
Yeah.
So I just think so we've talked about overwhelm, and the other thing that you mentioned, and we talked about, is the rage.
Yeah, absolutely.
That quite often goes with that. Do you want to start? I've talked loads of times about rage, but it is nearly always directed at Doug. I don't shout.
Right.
I don't shout at my friends. I wouldn't go into work and be like, "You fucking idiots." Whereas I would say that quite frequently
to your partner. Yeah.
When I'm at that point and I don't feel like he's getting it, or he does something really stupid, like leave something in a stupid place. But it's a rage that I never had or experienced before having children, for sure.
Yeah. Do you want to just say a little bit about why you're angry?
Yes,
well,
please.
I mean, lots of people get angry. Some people get sad. I think often those two things are quite linked as well. I think a lot of people talk about that experience of suddenly experiencing rage. I think often with the second child, more so than with the first. I think a lot of people feel that with the first, they have some emotional fallout, but it's often with the second and the increased demands, or going back to work, or it's like you were saying before, it's that kind of extra thing that just adds on to what already feels quite challenging.
Yeah.
That can tip us over into feeling that we're not as able to control our emotions.
Yeah.
And it's basically emotional outbursts. So in many ways, it's the same thing that we talk about when we talk about kids and tantrums. You know, it's the same process that we go through.
Yeah.
When actually, you know, all that's happening at that point is that we lose our ability to control our impulses.
Yeah.
So often that happens because we've gone into fight or flight mode. So essentially, what happens when we are stressed all day, every day, which a lot of us are nowadays, you know, we do live in a time where levels of stress are just sky high all the time. The pressures that we put on ourselves just add to that. So what that does in our body, which is something that people are talking about much more recently, which is great, is that we are under physical stress. So we kind of interpret that physiologically in the same way that our ancestors would have interpreted an actual physical threat. So we go in kind of fight or flight survival mode. And what that does in our brains is that it's this kind of lovely big bit of our brains at the front, our frontal lobes, which are involved in planning and reasoning and impulse control and emotional expression. That literally disappears.
Oh,
and you can see your kids, you know, losing it. You know, when your kids lose it, they completely lose their capacity to hold it together. They just physically can't do it. And they are just firing their amygdala. So that your amygdala is your kind of alarm system in your brain that is telling your body you need to get to a place of safety, or you need to fight off this, you know, big tiger that's running at you.
Yeah.
And at that point, all that happens is that Doug becomes your tiger. You know, that you direct all of that aggression somewhere. And often we do it at the person that we know will take it. So, you know, it's somebody.
But it's so hard, isn't it? Because they're like, what the hell is this? They're like, because they've not seen you like that before.
No, absolutely. It can be a real shock to both of you, you know. And often, you know, like you say, you so in terms of kind of what's socially acceptable, you don't tend to lose it at work. You tend to really try and kind of maintain that sort of I'm coping, everything's fine. You don't want to lose it at your kids. I think actually a lot of people would say that their rage does come out at their kids because it's towards the
well, for me it's not to the same degree.
Right.
It's more snappy. I'll be snappy,
sure.
But you can hear yourself doing it because it sounds so awful when it's doing
that, like,
but it doesn't feel quite so terrible when it's your partner. But it feels like it's almost like, and I will regularly say, I just need you to be kind. I just need you to be kind. And he's like, it's really hard to be kind to you when you're being a complete bitch.
Yeah.
And it's like, but that's all I want him to, and you want them to fix everything. And again, that's not realistic. So one of the things we've talked about is he's like, we need to look at what it is. So for me, it might be that I am just like overwhelmed with business stuff, trying to keep on top of that, and then stuff comes through with the kids, and then we haven't got any food shopping, and he's like, I can't necessarily do any more either, so we need to look at what else is there. And some of that has been like, we asked our cleaner to do a tiny bit of extra time. I know not everyone has a cleaner, but it's like, or is it asking your mum if she lives up the road, like, can you help me for these 2 hours? Or like to outsource, like finding something that can alleviate some of it, because you can't just keep adding, and sometimes your partner can't. I mean, there are definitely things that they can do, and we did that, but Doug started doing the food shop, because I was finding that even though it would take me 10 minutes online, and I always do it online, and it's super quick, but it was like the last thing at the week where I was like, I haven't managed to do that, and now we've got no food.
Sure. And then it's just that knock-on effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, like you were saying, you can outsource, but you can also think about what can go. And I think that what that's often what we don't do is, because we're placing so many expectations on ourselves, you know, to be all things to all people, that actually what we often don't look at is, well, what can go? You know, is there something that we maybe have kind of an expectation that was achieved before, but at this present point in our lives it's not achievable at the moment, and that disappear, you know. So, and if you think about just the amount of different expectations that a lot of us place on ourselves, you know, it's not just around kind of, you know, being a good mum, being a good partner, being a good work colleague, being
looking good.
It's also around appearances. It's around having a house. You know, Instagram's been amazing for so many things, but I think there is a pressure to have like an Instagram worthy house.
I get messages when my washing's up in the background, which is permanently is because there's so much of it, But I get messages going, "Oh, it's so refreshing to see your washing," and it's like,
Absolutely.
geez, like
Yeah.
it's there, it's always there.
Yeah. But
But
it
that's
is
because
contrary.
yeah, which is
Yeah.
scary, really.
Not realizing at all. And I mean, I had this sudden realization last year that I had this overwhelming urge to buy a neon candle, and I was like, I've never wanted a neon
40
candle
quid. Yeah,
before. And
don't
then
need it.
because I just hadn't realized that that kind of was being drip fed through to me.
Yeah,
So without us realizing at all, we kind of develop these sort of quite subconscious expectations
yeah,
of what is normal life. So normal life for our parents might have been a bit of a cluttered
so
house.
different. Yeah,
People were working shorter hours. There was
yeah,
much more sense of community around. There lots of differences then, and there were different challenges, of course, as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
But I think nowadays, thinking about the kind of the emphasis on appearance, the emphasis on just consumerism, having things, everything looking good. So not just you, but also your house, also your children.
But even, I suppose, with social media, the idea that you should be okay with how you look if you're not looking how you want to look, it's like, it's your, that is almost another thing to think about sometimes. It's like,
Yes,
oh,
yeah,
I feel crap in my body, but I shouldn't feel crap in my body because it's this, it's only a vessel and it gave me this baby, and so
yes,
therefore I'm a crap person, and then I feel guilty.
right.
Like, it's that. Those things, I think, can sometimes, the overwhelm in your head, what's going on in your head is
Yeah, but I
triggering.
think what's really interesting about that is how easily we can get stuck in that loop
Yeah,
where, because we are consuming so much information all the time, we don't ever stop and think about how to, we're not critical about it. We don't
yeah,
stop to reflect on, actually, is that reasonable? Is that
yeah,
true? Is that a fair assumption to make?
yeah,
I think that that's something. I mean, when you were talking before about the anger, when we have these outbursts, often that's when we lose our frontal lobe capacity. That's because we haven't been able to stop and get it back online again.
mm,
And in many ways, that's kind of what we're doing all the time during the day when we pick up our phones. We keep ourselves in that state of high adrenaline. We never just stop
mm,
and switch off and
mm,
have the opportunity to kind of pause and reflect. And actually, when you do that, I mean, I know lots of people who talk about taking, so, for example, while we're talking about social media, a lot of people, when they take social media breaks, will come back on and actually start to look at it with a more critical eye and
yeah,
realize, oh, actually, that is impacting on me, sometimes in a negative way. What can I do to make it feel, more positive?
mm,
Social media can have a really positive impact, but being able to kind of curate your feed, or all of these things that people talk about, that just means that you don't end up with that kind of incessant anxiety raising,
mm,
information overload.
mm,
Just thinking about your phone, but then also just in your day-to-day life, what do you have those opportunities,
mm,
especially for you at the moment? Moving house, it's coming up to Father's Day, so business is going to be really busy.
mm.
And then you kind of run to get the kids, and you rush to get home, and then you try and get the kids into bed, and you hope to get the kids in bed in time to do an Instagram live.
Yeah.
There's no space in that
No,
day.
it's like, and I say that to Doug quite a lot. I try and say that every minute, it's not every minute, but it feels like every minute of the day is planned, because
Yeah,
between drop off and pick up and that, all that day. And I don't feel like he has that. So that's something that is a clash point, because it's like, did you enjoy your toilet break today? Whereas you feel like you've been racing, and then they come in and it's this whole shift in, in for everyone, I suppose. But one of the things you're saying about taking things out, and
yeah,
I was thinking, one of the things I noticed that we all do to ourselves is, like, we add stuff in, even when we're feeling overwhelmed, even when we've already acknowledged that. So, like, a
yeah,
friend of mine was having a tough time and she was struggling. And then she sent, there was a couple of us on a WhatsApp, and she was like, oh, they're asking me to be the school class rep.
right.
And I rang her straight away. You don't ring, there's some friends you don't
Yeah,
ring that often because they live around the corner. I rang her straight away. I was like, don't you dare. Like, you don't. And she was like, oh, but everyone's saying that I'd be really good at it. And it's like, of course they are, because they don't want to do it. But it's that you're letting people down if you don't do it. And I was thinking, well, our kids are going to be at school, like primary school, say, is like, what, 7 years. So, but those first few years are probably tying in with having other small kids and
yeah,
maybe trying to get back into work. And it's like, there are other parents, or there
yeah,
might be parents who have slightly less on, or maybe they're just better at juggling. But I think, again, and then it's the guilt that people feel. So another person messaged and said she was on a school trip volunteering, and then a business thing came in and she had to deal with it on the phone, and she's maybe watching these 4 kids, and like, it's super stressful.
yeah. That's so
And
stressful.
probably she shouldn't have done the school trip, maybe, like, because she's got too much on, but you then feel guilty and like that. Oh, that it's it's such a horrible thing to just bubbling along thinking, shit, I can't do this.
Yeah, but I think you end up saying yes to things when you're overwhelmed because you just don't have the capacity to think about whether you can do it or not. So you say you don't want to even have the conversation that it would involve to say no. And then you kind of just push it away thinking, well, that's not for today. I just need to deal with it urgent. But actually, when you're just piling things on, the pressure that builds, there has to be inevitably an emotional fallout at some point.
Yeah, and that's that, and it is exactly that, a fallout. Like, you'll be doing it, and you can do it. And actually, we can. Most of us can do it. We can keep going. But then something minor will happen. I remember. Well, actually, someone messaged yesterday and they said that they got to pick up and they were last one. The kids were the last one. They just burst into tears. Yeah. And I've done that on the way to nursery. I remember my kids were charging down the river and cut in front of this woman who just went, "You should control your children." And I just burst into just was like, I'm terrible. But if I'd have been a different day, I would have just been like, okay, that's quite rude or something. But I just totally lost it. And that tipping point, somebody was asking, what do we do? Do we show our children that? And I thought that was a really interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, before we go on to that, just to say about that kind of when you do have that burst into tears, that's your adrenaline. So, if you think about what we were talking about before, that you're kind of constantly in that fight or flight. Yeah. Actually, what has to happen at some point is that runs out. We cannot be in that state all the time. I think actually what I was thinking about as you were talking there was that state is really valued in our current society. To be in that kind of really I'm just going for all the time. That's really rewarded. You're seen as being a high achiever.
Oh, you're Superwoman. How do you do it?
Yeah, absolutely rewarding. So there's a function to that behaviour, but actually physiologically we just cannot continue like that. So I have that conversation with a lot of people where they feel like their ideal is to be in that kind of what is actually a very highly stressed state all the time, and then feel like they're failing when they're not in that highly stressed state. Yeah. So because you just cannot keep motivated, at that level for that time. Eventually, your energy levels just run out. Yeah. And then you crash. That's what leads to burnout. And then actually, you end up having to rest or you get ill because you've just been going at it for so long. Yeah. So in many ways, it is so important to think about this in order to get some balance, because the inevitable consequence is that crash. If we can convince ourselves that we're not going to get there, because it can feel quite nice, can't it, being in that kind of quite high adrenaline state.
There's that point that before you fall over where you're like, I am pretty good, because you're like, and Doug will say, oh, you do so much in one go, and you're like, I know, but it never lasts.
No, it can't.
You're
but it can't.
Possibly mess.
Yes, and that's the flip side of it. That if you're going to strive to be doing that much, then there will always be a flip side where there will be inevitable fallout.
Can it sometimes also come quite a lot later? Because I quite often think when I had our first baby and Doug was ill, so he was diagnosed with cancer when Buster was a baby, and when Buster was born, because there was so much going on, he just finished treatment, and I coped. I look now, I think I coped quite well. The fact that my fairly new husband had been really ill, and But when we had my second baby, I was awful, and I really struggled. And there were points, I went to the doctor, and there was a point where I was just like, I'm not right, and I guess it was postnatal depression, but it kind of was managed. And looking back now, I think it was almost the expectation I had when we had our first baby, and all that didn't happen, but I kept going. And then when it was the second one, I had such high expectations of what he would be doing to help me and how it would be, and it just wasn't. And I think that contributed. So it's almost like you can't hide it. It's going to come out eventually at some point. It might be 10 years later. Yeah. Is that right? Does that sound?
Yeah. I mean, that can absolutely happen. I think there's two things in what you're saying there, in the kind of, perhaps having the second child and reflecting back on how it was when you had your first child, that actually sometimes when you're just in that coping mode, you do shut off your feelings in order to be able to just deal with the
Yeah.
here and now. And at some point in the future, often there will be a point where that needs to be processed.
Mm-hmm.
So we can sit with that, and it can feel quite unresolved for a long time. It's not necessarily something that's in our conscious mind. But often then something can happen that will remind us of that time, or just that, that actually there comes a point where you need to process it. It will still be sitting there feeling unresolved. But I think also just what you were saying there, actually, early on with your first child, there was no expectation that I guess Doug could help you.
No.
But your expectation was, I'm going to have to do this on my
Yeah.
own.
Yeah.
My own.
Yeah.
Whereas, second time around, it's like, oh, hang on a minute, this is not what I expected.
Yeah.
And I think that often that's a huge kind of theme for a lot of people, is that idea of, this is not what I signed up for. I had this idea in my mind of what motherhood would feel like, what it would feel like to be an adult woman, what it would feel like to be in a relationship.
No, none of it.
And it just doesn't turn out to be that way. But there's very little out there about how to then have the conversation about, well, how can we fix this? And I think a lot of people then think, well, this might be something to do with me. Other people seem to be coping, so maybe it's something that I'm doing.
And that's
we do tend to do that.
That's a big piece, isn't it? Where you think everyone else. But I feel like from writing the blog, from talking to people like you, from the talks and things we do, I don't think anyone's coping. Like, even the people that look like they are, there'll be something. So it might be their relationship, it might be their work, it might be their friendships. I don't know, but you can't manage it all the time and look amazing. Like, it's just not possible. It's like, but once you realize that, I think it makes you feel slightly better, because like the comparison thing.
The comparison thing, absolutely. And I think actually the people who are coping have much lower expectations, so they might be coping because they have very realistic expectations about what they're able to achieve.
Yeah.
But also it just begs the question, why do we want that? Why is it that we want, why should that be our aspiration, to do all the things and look great and have a great house? Why is that why is that the pinnacle? Actually, when you think about your values,
it's not happiness, is it?
It's not. That does not lead to happiness. And I mean, that's another question though, is happiness the ideal? Because I think that's also a bit of a fallacy, that we have this expectation that we should be, especially as mums, that we should be joyful all the time. And if we're not happy all the time, then somehow, this is that we're kind of failing in our motherhood because we're not enjoying every minute of our children. These are all things that I think are being questioned now, but there's so many kind of unspoken ideals there that we aspire to without realizing.
But that's my third baby, and has been so much more enjoyable because my expectations have been so low.
Yes, absolutely.
From the pregnancy to those first weeks. So, and if I had a day where I cried, I just was like, I didn't even come on here, or I'd just phone a friend and be like, I'm just going to cry today, but tomorrow will be different. And just having that acceptance helped me so much. Like, and all saying like, today's going to be shit, and did the whole drawbridge thing, like, just, I'm not going to try and do or be anything today apart from just kind of survive it. Yeah, and that really helped.
And it took you 3 children to get to that point where you get with your expectations and think, okay, maybe this is all I can manage. This is good. And actually, I know it's talked about quite a lot, but the idea of the good enough mum, I don't know whether you've come across that concept. That's Donald Winnicott from the 1960s talked about that. Actually, the way that he framed it was that trying to aim for perfection is just as damaging as neglect.
Right.
In both of those circumstances, we actually lose sight of the child. It's all about kind of what we're doing or what we're not doing. But actually, when we just aim for good enough, getting it right some of the time, not all of the time, then that can really help us to tune into what our children really need. It's not about appearances then, or striving or doing a project. It's just about dealing with what is going on at that very moment for your child in your relationship. And I think that's such a helpful concept.
Yeah.
Just good.
Yeah. But it does feel like with a lot of this, it's about accepting, not feeling like it has to be that high achieving all the time, and accepting accepting the roller coaster of it, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. That you're going to have down days, and I mean, I was talking about this with someone today, actually, just the idea that, that we should be happy all the time. That I think that is something that, has been around for a long time, that
Was
as
the
long,
drive for that?
yeah, we strive for that. And actually, when you do a mindfulness course, so I did the sort of 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And one of the things that was so interesting about that course is that it really helps you to tune into actually just how much your emotions will change over the course of a day, even in an hour. So most of the time, maybe you might feel kind of contented sometimes.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of the time you just feel a bit nothing, like maybe a bit bored. Sometimes you might feel angry, sometimes you might feel sad. Those things can come and go, but there's an idea there that all of those emotions are quite fleeting. That actually, I love the idea of treating your feelings like visitors, so that you don't kind of invite them to move in. You just sort of welcome them. Maybe they're bringing you a message, but they don't need to stick around. And actually being able to have that space from how you're feeling can be really helpful. But because it takes away that value judgment of, I shouldn't be feeling like this. And it helps you then think about what might be going on underneath that. Actually, why is it that when I do stop and underneath that overwhelm, actually I'm feeling really sad? Or when I do stop, actually what's underneath the overwhelm is anger. Because of millions of different reasons, but there are lots of kind of general themes in the women that I talk to. Around that kind of what you talked about before, the emotional labour, the kind of overwhelming load that we end up with, not something that we didn't necessarily feel that we've agreed to. So often I think underneath that we kind of keep going to distance ourselves from how we're feeling, and then when we stop, actually we realise that what we're feeling underneath it can be quite different.
Just on the mental load, because that is something that is massive for overwhelm, and a couple of people have commented, why don't men feel this? And this is something that we talked about before, about that a lot of it is carried from our previous generations and stuff. I don't know, and I remember you quoted some research from like the 60s about motherhood, and I found it really helpful. I can't remember
think what that was. Was that
it was some research about how people weren't satisfied being. Yes.
And I've completely forgotten who it was who did that research.
we can come back to it.
But it was back to me. But it was in the 1960s. Yeah, she was an anthropologist, I think, or sociologist. So she'd gone back actually for her kind of school reunion, from what I understand, and ended up interviewing women who were housewives in the 1950s. And that was the first time that there was a recognition that actually these women were not happy with their lot. That there was a kind of I've got a total mental block on what it was called, but essentially what they talked about was that there had been this kind of expectation that this is just what women did and that women were happy with it. And it was the first time that actually people started to talk about the fact that maybe women weren't happy with this kind of position that they were taking.
Yeah.
And I think from there, that was kind of the start, really. I mean, this is kind of, I'm sure women's studies, people will tell me that I've got this completely wrong, but that was the start of that kind of feminist movement in the 1960s of realising that actually men and women could be treated equally. I mean, we're still not there yet, are we?
And I think that's a
major part of the problem.
It's such a major part, because one of the things that I quite regularly have seen debates on, or someone says, oh, my husband and I share it 50-50, and they're talking about like cooking and cleaning pretty much. Yeah. And like, if it was just down to cooking and cleaning, great. But there's so much other stuff that's going on, which could be that your dishwasher's broken and you're trying to work out the admin to sort that. But it could be remembering the school report, remembering the packed lunch, which I don't always do. Like that, who needs their eyes testing, who needs a doctor's appointment, who needs, the list. And someone's birthday and your mum hasn't had all those things. And that's the thing where it is, in most cases, in most people I know, the woman picks that up. But the difference is now that we're also, a lot of people are, I think it's something like 90-something% of women now work in some capacity. So not everyone's full time, but, and that's completely different to our parents' generation. But we haven't worked out how to manage it at home. So, and that leads to that overwhelm, but it also leads to the rage, because you're sitting at home going, you fucker. And also, I suppose, before you have children, it doesn't, I used to make, this is ridiculous, but I used to make Doug like quite lavish sandwiches. like packed lunches. I don't know, like now I hate me back there, but I guess it's like being home. We wanted to be homemaker, right? But at the time I didn't have children and I was just going to work. And then obviously I had kids, and it was like he got dropped. You know, all the things that I would have done before to care for him or anything else was dropped because it just wasn't realistic. And that was a massive shift, you know, but also you're suddenly at home all the time.
Yes, yeah.
And you haven't been before. And that's such a shift. So it's not surprising, that overwhelm is not surprising, because you also feel confined and then a bit resentful, but then also guilty because you think I should be enjoying this.
Should be enjoying it, yeah. And I think that, I mean, that's a big shift, isn't it? Where if you have had a career, and most people have actually got far in their career now before they stop to have children, because we are having kids older than before. So I think that can be quite a big shift in what has previously felt like quite an equal partnership suddenly becomes quite different. You know, just in the fact that whoever is staying at home is the one who is thinking much more about kind of household admin. And usually one partner will continue to go out to work, so it feels to the one at home that their life hasn't changed as much. Even though, of course, their life has also changed completely, just in a very different way. I mean, I think it's also really important to acknowledge that it's different in different partnerships. You know, that there is research to show that same-sex partnerships do tend to have a fairer division of household labour, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And a lot of this might be around kind of, you know, gender stereotypes and what we're brought up to expect. You know, it's interesting that you're saying that when you first got married, your expectation was, I'm going to be a homemaker, because that's the models that we had growing up. You know, maybe from our parents, but for the world around.
And I wanted to do, you know, like,
you want to do it.
I mean, what was going, but it's that learned behaviour. And this is something actually, and I talk about, there's a podcast on emotional labour on the Dear Sugars podcast.
Yeah, with Gemma Hartley.
It's so good. And they talk about those learned behaviours and how you see little girls and that have learned those behaviours, and then we carry them forward.
Yes.
And so what they actually do this, because I got Doug to listen to it, which was really useful, because they have a man on it, so it's a bit more balanced, but also they don't start bashing men, which I think is, because it's just not helpful. But they say both of you have got to relearn your roles. So, and that for Doug and I to both understand that, because otherwise it's just me going, and you don't do this, and you don't do this. Yeah. It isn't really gonna, I know when I'm sane and calm, that's not gonna get us anywhere either.
No, and I think actually so Gemma Hartley, who's on that podcast, her book Fed Up is I think absolutely brilliant, because what she really describes is what both partners lose out on.
Yeah.
She kind of owns up to the fact that a lot of her kind of overwhelm and emotional labour comes out of her wanting to do things a certain way, and us as maybe the partners who kind of feel more emotional labour load, needing to maybe give up some of that control as well. But all equally then, that whoever's not doing so much, actually what they lose out on in not being as involved in family life. So there's that kind of lose-lose, and I think when you frame it in that way, actually you then become a partnership in how do we make sure that our family dynamic is equal.
Yeah.
I think also we can often end up, because we're overwhelmed and we're not reflecting, how we have those conversations is to do that. You're not doing that, you haven't done that. But actually there's a really quick tip, is just to use I statements, you know, rather than you didn't do this, is to say, you know, I felt like this today, and I think it's because of this. So it becomes about your experience of what's going on, what somebody is or isn't doing.
That's really helpful, because also the statements will always be you always. And we did some before we had, because one of the other things that someone's mentioned is that her feeling of overwhelm and rage when she had a baby is putting her off having another baby, because she's so anxious about feeling that again, which I worried about. So when we were having Frank, we only did 4 sessions. We did 4 sessions of counselling because we left it really late and I was really pregnant. But it was really useful for that, how you speak to each other. And it was basically all about communication, which is relationships, right? So, and one of the things that we both do is say you always or you never, and so now when one of us does that, we kind of go, well, hang on a minute, is it never, is it always? Which when you're in it is really annoying, but because you're and again it's like, but if you were to say I feel like this, because it would be so much better, because then the other person's heckles are up, right? And you're kind of thinking, I'm not going to have this conversation. because you've
Yeah,
just said I'm always an awful person. Or
yeah. And
yeah,
you end up, I think, yeah, you're just both defensive. But I think also because then it's sticking to what is actually annoying you in that moment, you know,
yeah.
rather than putting
Oh
it
no,
all
I'd start listing.
the entire relationship have
Yeah,
annoyed you. I mean,
yeah.
Philippa Perry, you know, Philippa Perry's written this book, the book you wish
Parents.
your parents had read, which
Yeah.
is great. But she talks about fact tennis, that we can get into,
Mm.
you know, this kind of toing and froing of facts, which we can
Yeah.
do with our kids, we do it with our partners,
Yeah.
when actually all you're talking about is what's happened, and really what we should be talking about is how that makes us feel.
Right.
Do you see what I mean? So it's rather
Yeah.
than saying kind of, you know, when you didn't take the bins out, that meant that this kind of had this knock-on impact on my day, and then my day was so awful because da da
Yeah.
da da. And then they come back with yes, but, you know, so you end up with that kind of fact tennis where you're
Yeah.
just talking about, you know, proving each other wrong. Essentially, that's all that's about.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
trying to win an argument, it's about meeting each other at that connection point where you're talking about how you feel and how you can then reconnect in your relationship.
Yeah.
So the emphasis becomes on that. But I think often when we are overwhelmed, we can go to that place, which is often, you know, due to our own histories, you know, how our feelings about ourselves, our beliefs about ourselves, how we are in relation to other people in the world. You know, we can go very easily to that place of feeling quite dark and hopeless about things. So it's not unusual to feel that overwhelmed and then go, well, that's it. You know, it's just, it's all over, and he's never going to be able to do the things that I need him to do.
Yeah.
But they end up kind of in quite a loop, quite a spiral.
So what do you think, what are some things that people can do if you're in that spiral? Because something, when I wrote about relationships being hard, and I had quite a few messages from people saying like we've just split up or we're separated, and maybe
Right.
we didn't need to because
Right.
maybe this is part of relationships, which was
Yeah.
quite like, God, yeah, you know.
Yeah, it's really tough because I think, like we were talking before about expectations, you know, we never talk about how hard having children can be on a relationship. You know, all of a sudden you go from being a partnership to having a third person to think about. Often one parent is very preoccupied by that third person. So, you know, one partner can often feel quite pushed out. And we don't talk about that at all. You know, how do you continue to communicate and connect with each other, even when you don't have the time and the headspace to do that, when you might not want to have sex, you know, you might not
And
want to
that's very much, it's the headspace, isn't it? Because Doug will be like, you're being really when I'm in this state of overwhelm, he's last on my list, because it's like I've got to look after the children, I've got to do my work, I've got to, so I kind of almost shut down from him sometimes, like, because I'm just powering through, and he'll be like, you're being really cold, and then he gets a bit needy. And that's really hard cycle to break. Usually we need some time, like we need time together, but you don't feel like you can do that when you're feeling really overwhelmed.
But I think actually, time together, but talking together about what can help you maintain that well. Oh, sorry, I think I paused myself somehow. Just talking about how you can still connect even when you're in that state. So actually what we can often do is we kind of, because we feel quite defensive at that point, we might be feeling really vulnerable in our overwhelm. I think that what can feed into that is the social expectation that we will cope with everything on our own. You know, that is definitely a story that is around. So if you're in that mode, then actually, in order to be able to achieve the things that you need to achieve, you do need to push away other people. But we kind of look at that, you know, and how helpful or unhelpful that those kind of models are. Then we can think about, well, how do we actually draw on the people around us in order to help us get through this? Maybe we don't need to do it on our own. Maybe actually it's about finding the people who can fill up our resources that we can cope better with what life is throwing at us. And actually often I think even just stopping and having a hug, you know, you can feel very still when you're in that.
Or an old lady kiss.
Like this.
That's really warm, thanks.
But you know, actually, what with those, I listened to Dr. Chatterjee has this great podcast which he talks a lot about stress, and he had somebody on there the other day. He talked about how a 20-second hug can bring down your adrenaline levels.
Okay.
But it has to be a lengthy hug, you know, because actually you think
Doug does sometimes I'll be busting around the kitchen, he will literally like clamp me and he'll be like, come on, it's gonna come out. And I'm just like, It's
But then
hard
do you
though.
find that you soften after a
Yeah,
while?
yeah. If unless I'm too far gone, and then I'm just really angry that he's
And you just
stopping
get,
me. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
But if I'm not, yeah, but I do find as well, sometimes you're so busy feeling angry and overwhelmed, and you're almost sticking with the fact that you're overwhelmed with such that
yeah,
you're making yourself worse off, because if you just allow yourself to soften or just laugh because they do something, and you're choking back the laughter because you don't want to laugh because you're so busy being cross and
yeah.
overwhelmed, you haven't got time, and then it's like, God, it's such a cycle, and that's
It is
something
such a cycle.
that we both tried to, and from the counselling, just to like there's no, it just can't just keep going. One of you's got to break it, and then usually that will help the other one.
Yeah. But maybe that's also about needing recognition. You know, there's
Mm.
something there about I can't let go of my overwhelm because otherwise nobody's going to recognize actually how hard this is for me.
Mm.
And you know, I think in some ways maybe we don't want to let go when we're feeling that kind of
Mm.
because actually nobody's heard it yet. You know, it hasn't been recognized yet. And at that point, what we maybe need is for somebody to say, "I can see that you're really struggling,
Mm.
and what can I do to help you?" Or
You,
even not even what can I do to help you? Just I can see that you're struggling.
yeah.
You know, just having that acknowledgement can sometimes be really powerful.
Isn't it funny that if you think of any representation of, or majority representation of relationships on everything, this never happens. You don't have a woman standing in the middle of the kitchen going, "Oh God, get off me!" Or you can imagine something like Fleabag, but like just
Yes.
like there's not that much real representation of relationships. So again,
No.
you can think we are doomed because everyone else is having a great time and
Yeah,
shagging and all of it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Which
And
again, which just adds to something to feel
which
anxious
adds
about.
to that pressure. Absolutely. I actually was talking to my daughter the other day about fairy tales and how, you know, fairy tales can set up such unrealistic expectations of what relationships are going to be like. And we were saying, you know, can you imagine if you had a relation, you know, fairy tale that was about two people who sort of liked each other and then
It
they
was all
decided
right
to
sometimes.
get together and then they talked about getting married and then they decided not to and then they had lots of arguments about laundry. You know, it's like that's the reality for most people. But if we
Yeah.
had the stories, I mean, nobody would buy them for one thing. But
Mm.
actually, that just if you think about what is represented, you know, it
Mm.
tends to be, you know, boy meets girl, huge, beautiful romance,
Mm.
something. Often there's like a huge power imbalance in those relationships.
Mm.
And then it ends when they get together, and there's never any kind of a what
What
happens.
happened next? Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Right.
think that those kind of stories are maybe coming out a bit more now for our children, which is great.
Mm.
You know, I think that there are more representations of like Fleabag or there's that great Australian show, The Letdown, that would kind of
I
really
haven't
show
seen that. Yeah.
it's brilliant. You know, it's really about the kind of realities of what it's like to be a parent.
Mm. And just think if there's, because we should probably tie up soon, but I was just thinking if there's anything
Yeah.
else that came up.
Were
One
are
of
you
the things.
I was just thinking you said before about being overwhelmed in front of our kids.
Yes. Yeah.
That was one question, and I think I just wanted to say that that's going to happen. You know, that often we can feel like we need to protect our kids from our emotions, and you know,
I suppose, what age do you feel like you can explain? Because I'm starting to feel with Buster and Mabel, they're 6 and 8. If
yeah,
I were to say, like, Dad's away and I'm feeling tired, and there's 3 of you to get ready, so it'd be really helpful if you can help me get ready and put your shoes on or whatever.
yeah.
It's starting to get there. It depends on the mood and what day they're in, but I don't think I feel guilty about it. You know, like,
Well, you're just explaining that you're a human being and that you have
yeah,
kind of feelings and needs, and I think that there's a fine balance. You know, I think that often when we're overwhelmed, because we lose that reflective capacity, sometimes we maybe say more than we intend to. You
mm,
know, and our children can become a bit of a sounding board, which isn't
mm,
always helpful. But
mm,
certainly, I think being able to explain, you know, this is why I reacted the way that I did,
mm,
and actually, this is nothing to do with you. I mean, that's the key. I think no matter what the age is of the children, it's being
mm,
able to say, this belongs to me and
mm.
I'm going to sort it out. It's nothing to do with
Yeah,
you.
because in the midst of it, you can be blaming them and saying like, "You did this," and then
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
angry. And actually, quite regularly, it's probably something else, or it's a bad day, or it's
yes.
hormones, or
Or you
I
would
had
have
quite
had
a lot of messages about
to,
hormones as well, and people
right,
saying about, and I mean, I don't know what you can do about that, except for if you know generally when those
when
waves are
they,
happening.
Have you come across Maisie Hill's book, Period Power?
No, I haven't, but I would like to have a
So
look.
maybe she should be your next Insta
Yeah.
live, because she's brilliant and has lots of really useful information about, kind of managing your hormones, also kind of regulating hormones.
Mm.
So yeah, she would be a good person to talk to about that.
Yeah. Okay. And the other one that did come up actually was, so we've talked about so it's kind of taking things out, because I had a few about returning to work and how stressed they were, and I can
Yeah,
really remember that, because you're thinking, I feel overwhelmed already. How the hell am I going to add in work? And
yeah,
I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about lowering expectations. So one person I messaged then, she was like, when will I have time to cook, and
yeah.
what we're going to eat? And I was like, well, just, you're going to have to go with beans on toast for a few nights, like,
Mm.
or because if you're trying to do what you did before, which might have been to cook a meal, but that might be because you're on maternity leave and you're home most of the day,
Yeah,
you just can't do it. So again,
yeah,
it's like
yeah,
lowering expectations, because at some point
yeah,
you're back in a pattern, right? And then you
yeah.
can.
But I think it's about kind of recognizing that there will be moments when you're just in survival mode,
Yeah.
and
And
everything
before you get there.
before you get there, asking for help when you can,
Mm.
lowering your expectations. But I think no matter what's going on, being able to just stop and take pauses, taking regular pauses can be the most helpful thing to just get your adrenaline levels kind of feeling a bit more steady again.
Mm.
And also just breathing. I mean, it's such a simple thing, but it is the most effective way of calming down your stress system.
Mm.
So the tip is always to elongate your out breath so that your out breath is longer than your in breath.
Yeah.
And the reason that works is that when we are in our kind of fight or flight system, we often breathe very shallowly. So we're all kind of in our chest. We breathe very quickly. And that's to kind of get our muscles pumped up, ready to fight something off or run away.
Mm.
The opposite of fight or flight is your rest and digest system. And
Mm.
that's when you're telling your body, okay, I'm safe. It's time for me to relax now. There's nothing for me to worry about. So in a way, you can almost trick your body into thinking that you're relaxed just by using your breathing.
Yeah, because that will be the night waking will be, for me, I can feel everything's going too quickly and it shouldn't be
Yeah,
doing that, and it's almost, it
yeah,
wakes me up and then I'm lying thinking about stuff.
yes, yeah. But using your breathing actually is
Yeah.
such a quick way of just letting your whole system calm down again.
Yeah. Okay. And then one other thing was around crisis management. So what if something really big happens? So this, I suppose it could be like a death or infidelity or something like that, and that was something someone asked about.
Right. In
And
terms of
feeling overwhelmed, I guess
how
feeling overwhelmed because there's loads of stuff to do, and it's not that day-to-day racing. It's like something massive happens.
yeah. I mean, I guess as we've said, it's around thinking about what you need to be able to kind of support yourself or to get support during that
Yeah.
time. I mean, crises do happen, of course they happen, and often we cope with them much better than we think we're going to. But I think we just have to normalise that in that sort of situation, it's completely normal and perfectly acceptable to be overwhelmed.
Mm.
That there will be times in life perhaps where actually you don't feel like you're coping very well when big things happen, or even just because of the kind of drip of little things too. But that is also a normal part of life. We can't kind of be on top of things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And in those kind of circumstances, it's so important to get support, whether that's from people around you, whether that's from services, lots of great organisations who can help you in both of those circumstances. If you're thinking about bereavement or infidelity or other kind of big life events, there are lots of really great national charities that can support families during periods of time like that. So I think then it's about kind of getting in all of the resources that you possibly can, because knowing that you're going to be very depleted at that point.
Mm. Okay. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say. I know there's been loads of comments and there's
Yes,
lots of conversations going on
so
between
many
people, which is
things.
brilliant.
Yeah, I promise that we will read the comments afterwards. Yeah, just to say, if people have got specific questions, then they're very welcome to send me a message. I will try and get back to people. If there's stuff that people wanted us to cover that we didn't, then do feel free to message me. I'm happy to answer questions outside of this time. I
And
can
I
see
think,
lots of comments there, so we probably don't have to get them all.
but I think the thing that a few people saying like they needed to hear this, or it makes them feel less alone. It's like, well, I think if you can find somebody, another mum, probably if it's mostly mums, or another woman, or who I find that tonic of when you meet up with a couple of friends and you just need, and you kind of all sit there, and I find we kind of go in a circle where we might start by going, and then he did this, and da-da-da,
Yeah.
and then at school this happened, da-da-da, and then you kind of soften each other, and then you come out the other side and you've laughed about it, and then you go, oh, but he is an amazing whatever. Like you kind of, but you need to be able to talk about it and vent about it, and also recognize that you're all feeling the same thing. If I'm thinking of a certain two mates, every time we get together, at least one of us cries. Usually 2 out of 3, sometimes all 3, because everyone's got so much going on, and we don't speak all the time. But then when we do see each other, it's like you're downloading, and I suppose just remembering everyone's got lots going on.
Yes, yeah, and welcoming those conversations as well. That if you feel like you've got the capacity to hear that from somebody else, asking how are you doing. We don't often, and like really, really waiting to hear the answer, and also for us, not answering that question always with I'm fine, everything's fine. I think we can so often do that. Actually, everything's really difficult at the moment, and I'm really busy at work, and the kids are going, I've got loads of problems with the kids, and my partner's been away for ages, but everything's okay. And we always have to kind of add that caveat, don't we? That I'm coping, everything's fine.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I've definitely done that this week. I burst into tears on a friend as I saw in the street, because it was just one of those things where someone goes, "Are you okay?" And I wasn't. And I burst into tears. She was like, "Come on." She put her arm around me and wheeled me back to her house with Frank and gave me a cup of tea. And that's all I needed. But I was still, as we were walking along, as I was crying, I was going, "I'm okay, really, I'm fine, honestly, I'm fine."
Everything's okay.
You're not. Yeah.
I think it's two ways, isn't it? It's us asking that question of other people, and really not accepting I'm fine when we can see that somebody's not fine. And also being prepared to show our vulnerability and say, actually, I'm not coping that well at the moment. And people are often really happy to offer support, that they're just waiting to be asked. It's a very British thing, isn't it, that we kind of do the stiff upper lip, and unless somebody really asks us for help, we often don't offer it because we don't want to impose. But actually, once you open that door to support each other, that's when our connections and communities can grow.
Yeah. Definitely. Cool. Thank you, Emma. And thank you everyone that joined.
Yeah, thank you. Do be free to be in touch afterwards.
Cool.
Bye.
See you. Bye.